everyone. Welcome back to the Light Up Your Metabolism podcast. Today we have a returning guest and a personal friend of mine, Matty Lansdown from Down Under. Matty is a scientist, nutritionist, and emotional eating and self-sabotage coach that specializes in weight loss and self-confidence for women and busy moms. Starting out in the field of nutritional epigenetics and spending several years working in hospitals as part of a disease research team, Matty believes that most disease and illness is not due to bad luck, but as a result of poor nutrition and lifestyle choices. Matty's extensive experience allowed him to uncover the deeper challenge people have with health, which isn't about calories or kale, but in fact, mindset and behavior change. Having been on his own personal development journey, Matty is now super passionate about showing people how to level up their health so that healthy habits and the best food choices are easy and natural. Likewise, Matty's weekly podcast, How to Not Get Sick and Die, provides his followers and clients with a deep dive into nutrition and how to develop healthy habits that last. I loved this conversation so much with Matty. I felt it was so helpful. And this is so much of the concepts that I myself talk about in my coaching calls and blood sugar mastery. But Matty has really developed such a powerful framework. And if you are struggling with emotional eating and self-sabotaging behaviors, you need to check out Matty's work. And first off, start by listening to this message. You're going to be like, oh yeah, I get it. He's so good at articulating where these things are coming from. P.S. A lot of it comes from trauma, and just being able to articulate so much of it. So much of this episode felt like a therapy session for me. I have not always had the best relationship with food, and I think it's just like as with any relationship, it's a lifelong journey to improve and manage our relationship with food. So even if you don't struggle with emotional eating, you have things on lock, you are still going to get so much out of this episode, because also we talk about food, but this could be for any of our vices or addictions. We can replace the word food or sugar in this conversation with things like alcohol or scrolling on social media, or cigarettes, or whatever it is that may be our vice. And so I feel that, in the conversation of getting off of sugar and improving your blood sugar and metabolic health, so many people are stuck, not because they don't know what to do, but because they are having these behaviors and emotions that are sabotaging their efforts. And so again, I can't say it enough, I love this conversation so much. Matty is such a wealth of knowledge. I love the way he articulates things, and you are going to absolutely get so much out of this episode. So thank you so much for listening to the podcast. If you get something from today's episode, please be sure to subscribe, to rate, review the podcast, share it with your friends, anyone who may be listening or need this information. And remember, I do my interview podcasts every Wednesday and my solo episodes on Saturdays. So if you love hearing other guest speakers talk about their expertise and some of my favorite products, I have the CEOs of companies coming on here, sharing about all my favorite things. And I also have a great blend of information that I share and that I see every day with my clients. So I hope you enjoy the 2 episodes a week. Here's the episode with Matty Lansdown. Hello, my healthy friend. I'm so thankful to have you back on the podcast. Welcome.
Thanks for having me. I literally have tears coming out of my eyes because we laughed so much before we hit record.
A classic, always oversharing and fun times with Matty. So if you guys don't know Matty, he was on my podcast before. I'm going to have to get the podcast episode for you, but I will link it in the show notes. And he is my good friend from Down Under, from Australia, if you can tell by his lovely accent. But he is an emotional eating coach. He helps people. Matty, please introduce yourself here.
Sure. So yeah, I started as a medical scientist in cancer research, became a nutritionist, and along that journey started realizing that people really struggled not with the information as much as the implementation and the consistency. And so then I went and did some emotional binge overeating sort of education, a bit of eating disorder education. And so now that leaves me in a place where I help mostly women, sometimes men, but mostly women with emotional binge and overeating, basically.
I love that. And that is what I'm super excited to talk about on this podcast is the implementation, because there's so many people that I hear from every single day and they're like, I know what to do, but and I do think that there's space sometimes for people to, often what I see on my end is people, let's say, going too low carb too fast, not replacing those carbs with healthy fats. So they have no energy source and they're hungry, and then so their body is not getting that nourishment that it needs. So I do think that there's a physiological component, but that's not what we're going to talk about today. Let's talk about more of the emotional component. What do you see as being the biggest perhaps reasons that people struggle with emotional eating, overeating, self-sabotage behaviors? Let's dive in there.
Yeah, so I guess there's always two sides to this conversation when it comes to any type of addiction or obsessive behavior or behavior that we can't get control of. And I think the first thing to call out is the system, right? The system of convenience and low cost foods that are just at the register when you pay, the psychological manipulation of the layout of supermarkets, the advertising and marketing which is strategically designed to convince you, your unconscious brain, to buy the food, that taps into your money beliefs of like, oh, it's only $1 and I can have, a day's worth of food in a packet of biscuits. And so I think the system has a lot to answer for. But the thing is with calling out the system is that it just leaves us in a situation of, I'm not a billionaire, I can't change it, right? So we then have to look at the other side of the conversation, which is the personal empowerment side of the conversation, and how can I navigate this system in a way that supports me and helps me? And the thing is, with all of that sugar, alcohol, social media, doom scrolling, all of that stuff that where we get stuck in a cycle of unhelpful, unhealthy behaviors, it also taps into, for many of us, things like trauma, things like stories and beliefs that we have about ourselves. It really taps into that sort of aspect, that darkness of us that really limits our progress, that stops us moving forward. And so we're all full of all of this information because we're all doom scrolling on social media, learning and listening. And like, I know what to do. I know I shouldn't be doing this, but I'm doing it. And I think everybody that I spoke to as a cancer scientist, everybody that I spoke to as a nutritionist, and the work I do now, pretty much everybody said, they know what they're doing wrong. I would say, what's your diet like? And they'd be like, oh, Matty, it's not great. I probably should drink less. I probably should. So that really brings into the awareness that most of us generally know. And sure, there's a template, maybe a dietary template that is slightly better or more therapeutic in a certain situation. But at the core of it, 70 to 80% of the work is just eat whole real food, right? So it's like, how do we start there? And that, for many people, involves diving deep into their emotions and understanding why they are so susceptible. I said this to a client this week, actually. There are some habits that we can just change by learning a new habit. And that's the habits that we learned unconsciously without any emotional attachment. Maybe we watched somebody else as a child do it, so we grew up to do it. And so the habits that are really easy to change, that's great. There's no emotional attachment to them. But the ones that are hard to change, that we've cycled back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, often, there's some pain down there, and there's some stories that need looking into, and we need to understand why we use food as a coping mechanism or to regulate our nervous system, or to, maybe we enjoy our private time really late at night, so we sacrifice sleep, we stay up and stare at our phones or watch Netflix because that's your private time because you've got 3 kids and a husband, and you don't actually get to experience peace in your life. So there's so many factors that come into this conversation of why we medicate with tools outside of ourselves.
Yeah, so well said. So I'm still stuck on the first thing you said about the system, about this convenience and like the marketing and the colors and the advertising and the convenience, and it's like you go to Home Depot and you have to be saying no to M&Ms. You go to like a checkout of, you go to the grocery store, you go to the gas station, you go to like Kohl's, you go to any store. I don't know if you guys have Kohl's there, but like
We
you go to
do,
a
we do.
department store, and it's just like there's candy and junk everywhere. So what is this doing like to the our neurochemical, like are we having to say, we're having to say no like 1,000 times a day, and we don't even realize it? And then is that like willpower? What is that?
Yeah, well, there's a thing that I learnt about well before I was in this world, when I was starting out with business and podcast and all of those things. And I remember people pointing to a number of entrepreneurs that wore the same clothes every single day. And one of those was Mark Zuckerberg, and there was Kerwin Ray, and there's a few others. And whether they're good or bad entrepreneurs, that's a conversation for another day. But the point is that they wore the same clothes. And it was a conversation about decision fatigue, right? About this idea that we, like you said, we're going into mental battle with ourselves, an ongoing tennis match all day. We see the advertising on YouTube. I search for so many healthy things on YouTube about medical interventions and weight loss strategies, and I still get ads for KFC. Like, how is that going on? Like, it's not even in my algorithm that I should be advertised that stuff, right? And then we've got the ads on Facebook and ads everywhere. Plus, then, like you said, you go to Home Depot or you go to Coles. We have that here in Australia. And yeah, you're doing all of this. It's like an ongoing tennis match. And if you think about that, like an aspect of your mind that is literally an energy reservoir or reserve, that decision making fatigue, it burns out by the end of the day, which is why some of the advice is really simple. It's like, don't shop when you're hungry, don't shop when you're tired, because you've burnt through the willpower, you've burnt through all of these mental battles. But the other thing is, speaking to the other aspect of the emotional sort of healing that might need to happen, is that those battles become far less of a battle if you start to identify as somebody who just doesn't engage with that stuff. And that doesn't mean we say no to it forever, but if your personality and your identity starts to shift into, being a healthy person, sort of whatever that means, but being someone who doesn't have to do these battles all the time, or has far less of these battles, you become much stronger in your conviction about your decisions. But there's a bit of work that's got to happen behind that.
Yeah, I definitely relate to that because I feel like a lot of the foods that I used to eat, I almost no longer see them as food. To me, I don't see it as an option. And so it almost doesn't even register in my mind that I have to say no to it because it's almost off the table to begin with. So it's like if I walk down the cereal aisle, for example, cereal used to be my favorite food growing up. Every single kind of cereal. I was like a cereal queen. I would eat cereal at friends' houses because I wouldn't eat the dinner. So I just, oh, Danielle will have cereal. Like, I mean, when I talk about, like, you guys think about me as, oh, she would never touch that. It's like, well, I grew up on cereal. So body by cereal, literally. But anyway, like I walk down the cereal aisle now and I look at it like, I see it almost like it's a toy, right? Like almost as I wouldn't eat fake cereal, like, that you would find in like a toy store, just as I see this, and it doesn't register to me as food. So what was the mental work that I had to do to get to that place? Because it's not that way with every single food, and I'm not better than anyone because of this, right? Like I'm not trying to come from that place, but I have a lot of my clients say that too, who have been on this journey for a while. It's like they just they don't see these things as food, as an option. So yeah, how do we get from A to B?
Yeah, it's a good question. So I think a simple distinguish thing in the language there is going from I don't, sort of I can't to I don't. Because if you say I
Hmm.
can't, that basically it triggers a few different things for different people. Whenever there's a rule or a boundary in place that you're enforcing on yourself, it kind of gives this sort of idea that you're trying to parent yourself, which, if you're healing psychologically, there's aspects of self-parenting which are helpful, and supporting yourself, and sort of healing parts of your child self, and maybe we can get into that. But the other part of being a parent is the rebellious child. So if you tell yourself I can't do that, which is something a parent would say, you can't do that. No, you can't, right? It's an authoritarian approach. Your inner child, who may be unhealed, who is just simply a child, whether it's damaged, traumatized, healed, happy, it's still a child, right? And we all have that inner child within us. And so when you try and parent a child and tell it it can't, if you're anything like me, I would say, if you said I can't, I'm going to show you how I can do it 100 times worse than you ever expected. And I took that as a personal challenge. And my mum would probably listen to this and be like, oh my God, he did it every time with everything, right? And so when you tell your inner child who wants the toy or wants the dopamine or wants the pleasure or wants the cereal that it can't, that little child says, oh, says who? I'm a grown adult. Right? I thought we were an adult. We can do whatever we like. And then we have this rebellious response. And psychologically, what's happening is often we find we're rebelling against the people that either traumatized us or that gave us the limiting beliefs about ourselves, or the boss that fired us when we shouldn't have been fired. All of these subconscious things that we're sort of asserting control over, but they're not really there, right? It's just that we've got this unfinished business or this unhealed part of ourselves, and we're using the sugar or the cereal or the alcohol or the porn or the social media as our little rebellion against the world. The catch is, in this scenario, it's not the world. It's a rebellion against ourself, which unfortunately leads to pain, suffering, obesity, diabetes, disconnection, depression, anxiety, and the list goes on.
Wow, so interesting. So you mentioned um, that we're rebelling against ourselves. Is that the same thing as like self-sabotage?
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. Totally. And I think
Mm.
the one thing with self sabotage is that a lot of people think that they're consciously sort of limiting themselves, or they're consciously not getting up and doing the work. But there can be multiple layers of that. And I think the either side of the coin is like, one side is self worth and feeling confident and full of self esteem, and the other side is self sabotage, right? And so
Right.
bouncing between self worth and self sabotage is really big for a lot of people. And I think anyone listening, whether it be food, whether it be alcohol, whether it be work, whatever, relationships, we can all sort of find parts of our lives that we're not showing up as best as we know we could. It's not about more information. Most people could sit down, and Jordan Peterson says this, most people can sit down and write 100 different things in their life that they could be doing better, that they know what to do to be better, that they're not doing. And maybe there's two sides to that conversation as well. One is the biological animal is usually pretty lazy. And what I mean by that is, think about lions. Unless lions are hungry, they are chilling out, right? They are relaxed. They're not doing anything. But when they're hunting, they're hunting. And so maybe it's not as grim for some of us as we think, because we hear like, why aren't I living up to my full potential? And it's like, well, hang on, let's look at all biological species. Unless they're hunting or procreating, they're pretty much chilling out all of the time, right? So maybe our self sabotage isn't as dark as we think it is. And what do we have that's a big problem for everybody in the
Mm,
modern world? Like stress overload, right? Nervous system overload, because we're go, go,
totally.
go, go all the time. And the second we take a break, we're beating ourselves
Yeah.
up for not being proactive enough, not doing this, not doing that. And so I think some of it actually needs to be kind of excused, which is often not what you'll hear about that. But I think slowing down is okay, and taking more space. Every other biological species is chilling out 90% of the day. And there was possibly once that we were as well, right? The other side of the self sabotage stuff that is not a social construct is when you were traumatized, or when you were hurt, or when a situation occurred in your life, or a repeated situation or sentence or judgment of you was made over and over and over again, that it meant that you now sort of feel like you're not worthy of good things. You're undeserving of good things. And
Mm.
it means that you show up in ways that, I know what healthy food is. I don't even want chocolate right now, but here it is going into my mouth. I'm not even hungry, right? And so there's this like automated
Mm.
process of like, not doing what's best for us. And there's, that's partially a conversation about nutrition and getting the right stuff and making sure we've got that in. But also, if you're not hungry, you've had protein, you've had fat, you've got the carbohydrates that you need, then it might be a conversation about, oh, what's not there with my psychology? Why am I doing this? What's showing up for me, inside of
Mm,
me that means that I want to suppress it. And that was a big part of my experience, which is how I got into this, was that I sort of had a violent childhood, and I used sugar as a young adult and late teenager to suppress any kind of memory, any kind of anger, depression, anxiety. I didn't want that to come out of me, so I would eat enough sugar that I basically was brain dead. My blood sugar was so high. I was like an alcoholic in the same way that they use alcohol. And I used it in my relationship throughout my 20s, or the earlier part of my 20s. Whenever we would fight, the way that we would fix things would be go and get pizza and lollies and candy and all of the things to suppress and disconnect and numb out, right? And so that shows up, like, I'd already had an honors degree in nutrition. Right? It's not like I had any naivety about what I should be eating, but it was this fear of dealing with what
yeah.
was inside of me. And so the result of that was just suppress it. And the consequence is, poor gut health, weight gain, all of those kind of things. But you end up on this loop of repeating the process of not dealing with the problem and sabotaging your attempts to improve, get better, evolve, and progress.
Wow, so interesting. So when you said that there could be like a sentence like echoing in your head from your childhood and stuff like that, um, that there was, my mom used to say to me, like, "Oh, are you going to eat that cookie?" or something like that.
Mm,
And that is, that definitely and other things caused me to have a really poor relationship with food and sugar. And I used to binge eat after school. I also think I was really undernourished because I would have like one Eggo waffle for breakfast with light syrup. And I would have, like a low fat yogurt for lunch with a granola bar and a juice box. And so I think I was actually
yeah.
really hungry because there's no protein in what I ate. Like, so I do think I was hungry, but I also, would go home and it would be like every cookie, all this, the lunch snacks that I wasn't allowed to eat after, that was special for like that only get packed in, my brother's lunchbox because he got, the Reese's and the Twix bars and all those things, but I
Mm.
couldn't get those and, ice cream. And so it would just be like eat everything I could. And it was my, as a people pleaser, that good girl stereotype. Um, it was like my way of rebelling, but then it's like it's hurting myself. So what do you do with someone like me? And
Well, some
how like what kind of could manifest from that? Yeah.
Well, someone like you with the words people pleaser is like 99% of my clients, right? And it's funny because in the eating disorder stuff that I did, there was literally a statistic about the people pleaser complex. And it was like 97% of people with eating disorders have some aspect of the people pleaser identity. And the interesting thing is, too, is that a lot of the people, just as you described with sort of binge eating after school, is that they do it in private. They do secret eating. They do secret binging in between the supermarket and home, so nobody saw it, and those calories don't count when you're in the car. Everybody knows that, right? And then whenever somebody's not in
Everybody
the
knows
room,
that.
or they would create situations so that everybody else was out and they were at home by themselves. And I think part of that is a rebellion. It's like, I can do what I want, right? But if we're doing it in secret, it's a totally ineffective rebellion because, again, it's against ourselves. That the person that is the victim and the perpetrator are both us, right? And that's the
Yeah.
like confusing aspect about any self-development or personal development journey, is that the person that wins and loses is both me and the system, or the person that I'm actually trying to punish, right? Is they don't even know what's going on, that they're not held to account, they're not judged. It's not sitting down and having a hard conversation to heal wounds. It's just filling those wounds with sugar. But I think the place to start with anybody that's got that sort of people pleasing aspect is, first we have to identify what is going on, because often if there's stuff that's happening in private by yourself, there's a lot of shame, right? There's a lot of shame attached to that, and embarrassment
Shame.
and guilt. And that could extend as far as the belief that I am not worthy of, success. I'm not worthy of good things. I'm a fat person and fat people shouldn't eat sugar. I'm a skinny person and skinny people shouldn't eat sugar because I'll get fat. Like there's all sorts of stories that buzz around people's head, and people don't want to be seen. People have these, I guess, stories of being like, if I'm seen to be doing this, people will really know how shit I am. They will discover the truth about me. And so then we end up in this conversation of imposter syndrome, of which is a disconnection from embodiment, right? Of being like, this is who I am. And there's two sides to that conversation, which I feel like there is to everything, right? Which is one where it's okay to be somebody that likes sugar. Sugar is designed to, and products are designed to addict us. So one, you're a victim to a system that's trying to manipulate you. That's normal. We all got sucked in, don't worry. But the other side is you're allowed to want good things for yourself. And sometimes we need to unpack that, because just as you said that line that you used to hear from your mum, it's the tone, right? It's the tone that you use that makes it judgmental. And so, I've had many clients have these sort of moments where they break down emotionally, where they realize the moment that the story they were given was given to them by their mum or by an uncle. And it's just a simple sentence. It's just a basic sentence that was probably not said with deep, horrible, traumatic intent, but it's just something that 7-year-old, 10-year-old, 20-year-old version of us just grabbed onto, right? And latched onto as part of the narrative. And then every time sugar popped up or alcohol or whatever, then all of those thoughts get triggered. And then over the course of growing up and becoming an adult, we add in all of these other stories. And it's like, well, I use the cookies after school to rebel against my mum. Maybe I'll eat the cookies too when my boyfriend breaks up with me. Maybe I'll eat the cookies too when I have to do something that I don't want to do. And so by the time we're 40 or 50 or 60, we have all of these reasons to eat the same food. And then it's like my attachment to the cookies is now like 50 reasons deep. But all of it stems back to this idea of the initial shame
All
or the
roads
initial.
lead back to
Yeah,
the cookies.
totally. And it goes all back to the core thing. All of those reasons we eat it usually stem back to that core of like, the mum shaming us for doing a behavior, and then being at conflict with ourselves of being like, I want my mum's love, but I also want to be a free living, human that's able to make my own choices. And again, we go back to that tennis match. But we have to get to that core and start healing that core of what it is. And for some people, it's heavy. It's like sexual trauma. It's like really, really heavy stuff.
Yeah. Wow, you nailed it. And just all the words that you use to describe all of the emotions and then the beliefs that are driving those emotions, just nailed it. At least for me, for sure. I could this feels like a therapy visit, so thank you.
You're welcome.
But yeah, so interesting how these beliefs live beneath the surface. And if you have you seen Inside Out too? Molly and I are obsessed with it. Have you seen it yet?
No, but you definitely have told me to watch it like multiple times. And
I told you, I sent you a
I
whole,
know.
oh my God. I sent you a whole voice note about it, I think, like
Yes.
begging you to watch it. In the movie, it's so, for me, I'm such a visual person, and like all these words about, emotions and beliefs, they do such a good job in the movie of making it so understandable. So it's like all these memories happen. I'm not going to give away anything, so everyone still go see Inside Out too. But it's like something happens, and then it's like an event happens, and then it's colored with an emotion or two emotions, right? And so then what happens is that some of these memories that are tinged with an emotion go into this little pool, and then from there it grows this like stalk that is called a belief. So it's like these things happen, these certain emotions, and then from those events and emotions, we get beliefs out of that. And so all these beliefs are going up into like these strings, and then it creates the personality. And what happens is like you can have a bunch of these beliefs in this little pool, and it's like, I'm a good person, I'm a good friend, like I'm a sore loser, or I'm not good enough. And like that creates a person's like this personality. And it was so helpful for me to see. And it's like, oh, I can see all these things happened. And then I have this belief that like, I'm not good enough. I'm not worthy. And it's like, it's so crazy that because I used to hear, things like, oh, you don't feel worthy of it. I'm like, okay, like I think I am, like sometimes I think that people who haven't really fully dove into this work may not relate to that. But I think for so many of us, it is really deep down there. So, how do you get people to identify some of these beliefs and uncover some of these beliefs? Is that part of what you do?
Yeah, absolutely. So I guess the first step is really unexciting. It is don't change anything because we have to actually do the habit or do the cycle or do the binging whilst also self observing. Because one of the things that I guess a lot of health
Mm,
programs, weight loss programs, any kind of healthy habit program does is it just says change, do the change, be sustainable, amazing, go. And pretty much in my experience, everyone that comes to me at least really struggles to maintain it either beyond the program or they 2 or 3 weeks in, they just give up. It's just too many changes, too overwhelming. And so we have to actually observe what is happening. And so I get people to start with a couple of weeks of just documenting. And this isn't counting calories, it's simply identifying what we're eating, where you're eating it, and what emotions are present in that situation. So we're connecting food, location, feelings, basically. And what we're trying to do is just
mm,
identify cycles or habits or situations. And sort of without me doing anything, most people start sharing, even a few days in and say, oh, I really noticed like I'm always standing up in the kitchen when I eat, or I always go straight to the pantry when I'm stressed. And I didn't realize it was stress before. And so we're just starting by bringing this stuff into the awareness, right? And so then when we understand a bit of the emotional stuff, like what is present, stress, anger, resentment, sometimes even happiness. Some people want to go and eat, get more dopamine after they've had some good news, right? More pleasure. And so once we know that, then we start to formulate. There's two pathways to go. One is formulating a list of alternative things that give you the same emotional experience. So because we can't suppress the pain and suffering, right? We
mm.
can't suppress the experience that our body is trying to express. So we still need to create a supportive environment for the expression of that emotion or that feeling or that hurt or that happiness, right? So we create a list of other alternatives that produce that. The other thing is that we obviously need to actually do some processing because even if we have a healthy habit that's an alternative, it's still a mechanism for escape, right? It's like initially we felt some pain, so we went to the pantry and ate cookies. We're distracting, we're procrastinating, we're suppressing the expression of that, sadness, let's say. So we want to do that in a healthy way without the cookie, but it's still fundamentally a suppression or a lack of expression, if that makes sense. So because you can't
Yeah.
necessarily express your tears in a 3 p.m. board meeting on a Wednesday, you need a helpful mechanism to actually allow yourself to manage that emotion without just going straight for the cakes in the middle of the table or straight to the cafe. So we still need to manage that situation and allow it to occur, but then we need to go and actually process. So it's like your healthy escape strategies need to be developed, but also a capacity for processing. And that's where we dive deep into like what happened in the past. Where did this start? Do you remember a time in your life where this feeling didn't exist? When did you first notice that it did exist? What happened in that gap? Right? Was there anything that happened? And sometimes it's not obvious. Sometimes it's a social construct. Just simply the people in your family, the friends of the family, or your social friends happen to live by a certain unconscious standard or situation or economic idea, and you just absorb the same idea unconsciously. They're living it unconsciously, and you're absorbing it unconsciously. And so it takes a little while to peel back those layers to say, oh, this unconscious thing that nobody around me is aware of, when they're doing it, this is the thing that's holding me back. And I use economic because that's a really easy one to sort of see. We've got different economic classes of society, and the one that you're born into, it predicts the
Right.
likelihood of success because we just absorb this idea of how to use money and how to get money and how the world works, right? So it doesn't even have to be a big obvious trauma. Sometimes it
Yeah.
can just be social conditioning.
Yeah. So interesting. So, how does I heard you mention dopamine,
Mm-hmm.
and you know, scrolling on my phone is, and having a job, my job is partially on my phone and on Instagram. So the double-edged sword of wanting to look at some content and answer questions that are in my inbox and post on Instagram, but then it's just, you get so sucked in. It's like, how do you do this? So it's just a battle that I find that I'm always fighting. And so I know that I actually took this like neurotransmitters quiz, and I think I'm most deficient in dopamine as a
Hmm.
like compared to, let's say, serotonin and GABA, based on how I answered these questions. And I'm like, oh, I'm not surprised that I'm super addicted to my phone. But
Yeah.
I find that a lot of people have the phone addiction as well. But does dopamine play a role in also, you mentioned it linked to pleasure. So I'm assuming it also plays a role in this emotional eating, these patterns that we may find ourselves in.
Yeah, you're 100% right. And the thing is, too, whenever we're like experiencing discomfort of a memory, of the current situation, the stress of the day, the one thing that's going to really, at least mentally, balance out the cortisol or the adrenaline response is a pleasure response, is a dopamine serotonin response, right? And so the faster that we can get through the stress, or suppress it, or mask it, because sometimes the stress actually doesn't change, the cortisol and adrenaline in your body doesn't change, but if you jack up the dopamine enough, it's like building a tolerance to a drug, right? Is that you jack up the dopamine high enough that it feels like you're not stressed anymore, but actually you're totally wired and your nervous system is still pumping with cortisol and adrenaline, right? And this is what we're trying to achieve when we've got the Netflix on TV, we've got our phones scrolling in our hand, we've got the other hand in a chip bag, and we've got like all of these stimulants that we're trying so hard to create a tidal wave of dopamine to just like suppress the cortisol and adrenaline response, when actually what we need is to sit with the cortisol and the adrenaline in a meditation and not drown it in dopamine, because then we just we enter this losing battle of trying to outcompete like our neurotransmitters, of which leads to burnout because you use all of the protein required for those neurotransmitters.
Wow. So interesting. So we're super stressed out, and we're trying to use dopamine to calm ourselves down. Is that what I'm hearing?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay. And what would a meditation do? What sort of neurotransmitters are involved there?
Yeah, good question. So basically, what we're trying to do in a meditation is it's sort of the longer pursuit of sort of pleasure, if you like. It's not as instant, not as radical in the sense that we're looking for something to just shock us out of the
Mm.
pain and suffering. The thing with something like breath work or meditation is that it's a very active form of reducing the activation in your nervous system. So what we want to do by sitting in that stuff is feel the
Ah,
discomfort, right? Is we want to feel the discomfort. And this is the thing we're trying to avoid. So I totally get that most people are like, that's terrible advice, Maddie. Go
oh,
towards the
yes.
pain, walk towards the fire. That's a terrible idea. Right? But the in the pursuit of seeking dopamine, we often create more physical pain and suffering by ingesting or consuming things that are not helpful, right? And so what we have to do is essentially sit and feel the stress. You want to feel the pain and suffering of the story or the belief or the trauma. And we don't always have time to go really deep with this. It can be 2 minutes. It can be 2 minutes of breath work. It can be 5 minutes of meditation. But the feeling of it is the processing of the emotion, right? And I mean that practically. Like literally, the breakdown of your cortisol and the reduction of your adrenaline is as a result of the physical experience of it, right? Because if we try and suppress it, it doesn't mediate it, it doesn't modulate it, it just continues to pump it out because we haven't dealt with the problem, right? There's a part of our mind which still identifies that thing as dangerous, as a fear, as a threat to our survival. So we have to actually confront that, right? And this sometimes takes months or years of processing and healing. But the practice of 1 minute at a time, one little session of breath work at a time, calms the nervous system. Bringing more oxygen in to the system and breathing out slowly is allowing the adrenaline and the dopamine to come. The adrenaline and the cortisol to come down. And instead of a jacked up sort of dopamine serotonin cocktail of, hyper excitedness and happiness and pleasure that lasts a very short period of time, we end up not jacking any of them up,
Mm.
which leaves us at this place of internal calm and peace, which for many people feels unsafe because maybe you were traumatized as a kid violently or sexually, and the idea that you're not on alert mode all of the time is a threat to your survival, which is another reason we need to do this 1 minute at a time for some people, one tiny step at a time, because your nervous system is used to being on, because that
Mm.
one time it wasn't, things went really bad. Really bad. And so we have to construct a new belief system that my calmed, peaceful nervous system is a safe place.
Wow. Yeah. And I had a, different type of, not as violent trauma, but also a different trauma as a child that makes my nervous system be on high alert, scanning for threats and scanning to see if, everyone's going to be okay around me.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, I can see how, like, I'm trying, as I'm doing my work with my trauma healing, like all year, basically, um, I was, I was noticing that sometimes it almost feels like they ask you a lot in different programs and things, like, what emotions do you want to feel? And it's like, do you want to feel peace and whatever? And I'm like, yeah, yeah, peace. And then I'm like, God, peace is kind of boring. And so it's like, is it boring, or is it, like, is that from just like our phones, that, or is that like deep trauma? Is that like this inability to feel relaxed actually, and feel peaceful, and feel okay with this stuff, like lack of stuff going on? So
Yeah.
I don't
As
know.
you're describing that, it makes me think. So, my partner is a relationship coach. And so, we have a lot of relationship conversations.
Okay.
And it's often the person that sees the stable guy or the stable woman as boring and unexciting. And it's the same thing in our body, right? It's the same thing. It's like, is it stable, right? Or are we just attuned for toxic and chaotic and messy? Right. And so, because some people are boring, by the way, like, there's some people that don't like adventure, and if you don't want to be boring, you
Yeah.
don't want your own physical experience to be boring, which is why figuring out your hobbies, is a good idea, and things that you do enjoy and things that do fill your cup, right? But I think that analogy is similar here. Is that it's like, am I just wired for chaos because of insert life experiences? And that's the reason that I fear stable or see or judge stable as boring.
Mm. Yeah, so good. So that concept of judging, that is also another thing that I think that came up on a podcast interview I did yesterday, and it's been something that Molly and I, our mutual friend Molly Eastman and I, have been talking about, is this, when, because we're both working on, nervous system and all these healing and stuff like that. And I think that a lot of people can confuse healing your nervous system with never feeling an emotion that feels maybe uncomfortable or undesirable. So I think that, and this is just based on like conversations that Molly and I have had, where it's like, oh my God, I feel anxious. And it's like, it's okay to feel anxious. It's the making the anxiety wrong that's not helping, right? So you're
Yeah.
saying we need to sit with the anxiety and say, it's okay that I'm
Yeah.
feeling anxious right now, right? And
Yeah.
accepting that, as opposed to trying to push it away or making it wrong, making it bad in some way. Is that like
Absolutely. Yeah.
that's kind of what you're saying, right?
Yeah, and there's
Yeah.
a little mantra that I give to pretty much everybody I work with, which is when you're going through all of that and the judgments are coming up and you're saying, I should be stronger, or I'm weak, I'm pathetic. It's just, I'm a human having a human experience. And if I was to be here on earth living my entire life, not experiencing every one of the emotions, maybe it was a wasted life, right? It would have been a very dull, boring life to have lived, to not experience all of the things. And so I'm a human having a human experience. I use it for myself when those stories come up for me, because just as you described in not judging the emotion, there's no one that's perfect, right? And so sometimes even myself, I'm like, oh, I teach people this stuff. That's the story that pops up. It's like, why aren't you better at this, Matty? And then I have to go, You're a human having a human experience, Maddie.
Yep, it comes up for Molly with some sleep stuff too, and it's like you can have these things. My blood sugar still spikes. Sometimes I still feel, very rarely, but once in a while, I still feel a symptoms of a low. I'm like, this is my before story. I get so mad. I'm like, this is inexcusable. And it's like, it's okay, like you have a body, it's good, there are certain, it's okay, so it's I think we just tend to make it wrong, and then you guys see us here podcasting, telling you what to do, and that, or giving you advice, and that doesn't mean that we don't still also need this advice. And like we are taking our own advice, and we're not perfect with it either. So you mentioned the word perfect, and as a recovering perfectionist, Enneagram 1, I have to ask, what are some tools that you have for my fellow perfectionists out there?
Yeah, well, I think it's just a matter of exposure, right? Like to situations that you know that being perfect isn't like is okay, right? It's not a dangerous place, but it's twofold. So the first is understanding that it's not a dangerous place, and two, understanding where the story came from, right? Like knowing why I felt the need to be perfect. Maybe similar to myself. You get 80% on a test. The question is, where's the 20? you know it's like that kind of psychology comes in. It's like, oh, 80 was pretty good, but if I'm not perfect, it's not good enough. That maybe that's where the story started for you,
Mm-hmm.
when your mum said that to you when you were 7 coming home from school, right? So we have to understand where it started, what it's useful for, because that's the other thing. What we do is we judge these qualities about ourselves that we feel are limiting, but that's not true, because they're not always limiting, right? Being a perfectionist holds you to a standard in some areas of your life that you're probably really proud of, or able to say, I'm the person for the job because I'm better than everybody else, right? So those qualities aren't 100% bad, right? They're not 100% bad. There's some good
Mm-hmm.
things about them, there's some unhelpful things about them, and it helps. Humanizes the wrong word, but it helps contextualize that, oh, my perfectionism can be a superpower, or it can really hold me back. And it's my choice as to how I utilize that. But if we want to actually embody someone who can make the choice, who has the capability to make the choice rather than be driven by it, we have to understand it, and we have to tiptoe and dabble slightly in places where we're not perfect. Maybe that is going to regularly to a sport that you're not amazing at, but you just really enjoy, right? And saying enjoying it is actually more important than being good at it. you know and there'll be part of you, there'll be that story that comes up and says, I'm never going back there, I'm so shit at that thing and it's embarrassing. And that's where you're like, I'm a human having a human experience. And so I know that Maddie said I should do these exercises to practice that it's okay and safe not to be perfect, and that prioritizing pleasure and fun and connection over perfection is okay. So I'll go back next week and I'll try again. And we're training the nervous system.
I love that. That's, again, very helpful to my perfectionistic tendencies, where I think that my belief under that is that I would only get, I would get recognition and praise, and that praise sort of stood in for love. Um,
Mm,
and so I felt I had to be the best at everything in order for people to like me and
yeah.
accept me and for belonging. And I was, looking at this, I'm like, God, no one wants to be around someone who's the best at everything all the time, or has this like incessant need to be the best, where they're acting ridiculous because they're acting like a sore loser, or like overly, it's like, okay, like loosen up a little bit. And I was just like, wow, it's actually sometimes doing the opposite of what it was intended for. So I think that when you can pick it apart like that, and you start looking at where does this come from, it's like, oh, I use this for like praise and wanting love and acceptance. It's like, okay, if I just want like love, acceptance, belonging, then I can get that even if I'm not great at pickleball or whatever, whatever it is. So I think, yeah, that's really, really helpful. And how do you see the perfectionism come up for some of your clients as like contributing to self-sabotaging behaviors? Do you see that happening? Because I certainly see it a lot.
Oh, Absolutely. Well, and it enters that conversation or the tennis match that we talked about at the start, right? Because there's part of them
Yeah.
that's trying to be perfect, and there's the other part of them, the unhealed, broken, traumatized part that's trying to rebel, right? And be released and be forced into its expression. And so it's that balance between, I guess, allowing that perfectionist tendency to come up and acknowledge it and see it, but if we don't heal that wound or we don't fill that void with the right stuff, then that tennis match is going to go on forever, because they often want to be perfect with the diet for the first 2 weeks. And many of my clients, we don't even do food stuff at all for the first half of the program. And their perfectionist tendencies are like, what
Amazing.
do I do? What do I do? What do I do? Where do I go? And they've got
Yeah.
nothing to latch
Yeah.
onto.
Yes.
And the idea of don't change, just document
Yep.
it is really unsettling in the beginning. And so, what the perfectionist tendency will
Yes.
do for some of them is it'll say, well, there's no food advice, so I'm going to binge eat until I'm told like what to do, basically, because it's going to start soon. D-Day's coming, and so they'll just smash heaps of extra food because they're waiting to be parented by me. And this is a really
Wow.
important part of the program, is that we want to be able to step into our adult self by the end of it, not our parent self and not our child self. Both of those parts of us will come up many times, but a lot of people use their practitioner or their coach as their parent. And this is like the personal trainer model. I need someone to yell at me, right? Um, if we can't be self
Yeah.
accountable or manage ourselves or manage our parts, then we're always going to need outside help. And whilst I think community is important and connection's important, we actually want to be able, most of us, to be okay by ourselves in our own time. And really, the mark of success is somebody at 10 p.m. at night that's tired with nobody else witnessing them, still making a better choice, right? That's someone that's really figured it out. Because usually when we're in private and we're in secret, nobody knows, and we can get away with it. That's the stuff that we can like bend all of our rules, right? Or bend all of the things that we've agreed to change about ourselves and slip back into old us, or the version of us that we're not proud of, which just continues the shame spiral because we're hiding it, right? And so I think the way that it shows up for many of them is that they either go really hard on breaking the rules or they go really hard on sticking to the rules, which is exactly why all throughout my work, I remind people at all times they have permission to do, behave, eat, and feel however they like. And actually, I don't really mind what you do. It's up to you to want it. I'm here with the tools and the guidance and the support and the D&Ms, but at the end of the day, it's you by yourself on your own that needs to want this.
I love it. I love it. So what we had a chat on the phone, and one of the things that came up was this concept of the cost of staying the same.
Mm-hmm.
So how does that factor into all this stuff that you're talking about?
It's a good one. I think a lot of people that I work with, it's often about kids. The cost of staying the same is that I don't get to keep up with my kids, that I'm absolutely depleted. I can't run around with them at the park, or even grandkids. I won't be around to see them or meet them, or they've just been born and I've just been, given a wheelchair and a diagnosis. And so a lot of the people that
Mhm.
I'm around, the cost of staying the same has a lot to do with not being a good mum, not being a good father, grandfather, grandmother, and being the sort of the person that's everybody sort of is obliged to go and visit, and nan's not fun, mum's not fun, miserable, grumpy all of the time. And I guess for those that don't necessarily have kids, it's simply the regret of not living up to your potential, and that's something that all of us wrestle with. I could be better, I could be working, but I guess true, in like I said at the start, true for some people. Also, hyperactivated nervous systems not natural. So it's a balance. But the idea that you don't live up to your potential is something
Yeah.
that motivates me for sure. Like I often feel like when I'm procrastinating or doing things that are unhelpful, I'm reminded, or the thing that brings me back is that I have the resources, the capabilities, the speaking skills, the confidence to achieve a lot. And so the fear of, especially with the fact that I've got a kid on the way, the idea that I want that kid to have a good role model that is able to tap into all of the helpful resources that they've got for themselves, whilst also saying it's okay to take a break and it's okay to not live up to society's expectation of who you think you should be, right? So yeah, balancing that.
Right.
But for me, it's the potential thing, and I think for a lot of people, it's kids, and the cost of staying the same is often an early death.
Yeah. And so comparing that with like the cost of change versus the cost of staying the same, I feel like there we tend to get people come to us and there's like they're in pain, they're suffering,
Mm-hmm.
they're struggling, and yet they're self-sabotaging. So a kind of question that we need to ask is like, what are they getting out of not changing? Because there has to be some sort of a benefit that they're getting. Is this something you go into with people? Like to look
Yeah,
at these like
yeah.
background behaviors?
Yeah, completely. Because just as I said before, the perfectionism has positives, right? And so sometimes the situation we're in, the chocolate or the doom scrolling or whatever, has more positives than perceived benefits, right? And so, like you said, it's like
Mm,
we're okay here because the chocolate makes me feel good. It gives me the dopamine. It gives me the pleasure, or staying up late and not getting good sleep because I get private time. That's more important than the sleep to my psychology, right? And the reason I say perceived
okay.
benefits is because I believe on the other side of the work, you're going to get a lot more benefits that you're not able to see, or you see them and you just don't value them. Like, and we've all gotten on calls with people inquiring about our programs or services, and there's the person that's like, just give it to me. I'm ready. Let's go. And the other person that's like, I know I should be thinner, or I know I shouldn't eat chocolate, or I know I shouldn't do this, but I don't know why I do. And the truth is, I think personally, that irrelevant of the state of your health, if you are at peace with your decisions, great, amazing, like, good for you. It's like, who am I to be the health police, to say everybody should want to be healthy, right? We've all got free will, at least of those of us, in the Western world. We can mostly exercise most of that free will to choose how we live and how we treat our bodies. So but if you're the person that's in denial about that, and it's like, oh, I've got to die of something. The amount of times I've heard people say that about smoking or drinking or eating terribly, they're just like, well, you've got to die of something, don't you? Usually that person feels terrible 7 days a week for 7 different reasons. They feel puffed at the top of the stairs. They did their back doing the washing. They're going to the toilet isn't fun. And so there's plenty of people that are also in denial. It's like, oh, getting healthy's hard. And I sort of think, well, if that's the story, let's look at hard. I got up this morning at 5 a.m. to go to the gym. That was hard, but equally, smashing heaps of sugar, having poor gut health, and getting hemorrhoids, that's hard. That doesn't feel good. So it's like, if we're talking the hard conversation, it's like, pick your hard.
Yeah, I love that. That's so good. So, Maddie, this has been amazing, and your program sounds absolutely fantastic. So, we will make sure to link everything in the show notes. But where can people follow along with you, and what offers do you have?
Amazing, thank you. So, How to Not Get Sick and Die is my podcast, and you, Danny, have been on there a bunch of times now, which is really cool. So, yeah, come and check it out wherever you're listening to this conversation. We're on that platform too. And then I guess we're sort of
Mhm.
moved our focus over to the world of YouTube. So, same thing, How to Not Get Sick and Die podcast on YouTube. We've got our video podcasts up there, lots of short form content as well. And then if you're interested in doing any emotional binge or over eating work, or you've yo-yo dieted for a very long time and you know all the stuff but don't know why you can't stick to it, then my website, mattylansdown.com, you can learn lots about our programs and inquire and have a conversation with me or one of the team.
Beautiful. Love it. Thanks so much for being here. And this was really helpful for me. So I hope I'm sure it will be helpful for other people too. Thanks, Maddie.
Thanks, Danny.